Hello and welcome to the Antique Auction Forum podcast. This is Martin Willis. This show started back in 2009, and I love to talk about interesting topics, and that will be another one today. And this show, just so everyone knows, it's not about slamming an auction house or any particular auction houses or the auction way of selling, but everyone makes mistakes, and I don't care what type of auction house it is. There are mistakes. I still believe in the auction business and the auction method of selling 100%. And for every story we can tell you about what happens at auction where someone hits a jackpot, there's probably 10 instances where either a picker or someone at an estate sale got a major find. There are a lot of people that are living very happy right now that had a major find at an estate sale or at different types of purchases, say if someone calls in a dealer. And sometimes this happened to me at the age of 18. I made a mistake. I bought something for I think it was $15 at the age of 18, and I sold it at the time for $400, which was really big for me then, but I had no idea what I had. I had no idea what I was buying. So that as well does happen. And so today we're going to be talking a little bit about kind of people hitting the jackpot, but also the legalities of it all. And I am very happy to have our guest today, and it's Dr. Laure Bandle, and she's an attorney at law at the law firm Borrell and Barbie in Geneva, where she advises clients in matters related to works of art, copyright contracts, estate planning, foundations and trusts. She again she's a lecturer in copyright and entertainment law. That's another whole thing. In Switzerland, she's a guest lecturer in cultural heritage and art law at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and she is also the director of art law of the Art Law Foundation, a foundation that aims to promote and coordinate the work and research in the field of art law. In particular, it supports the research and teaching activities in art law. She holds a PhD from the University of Geneva, and she has also published a book, which we're going to be talking about, of misattributed works, along with Edward Elgar. And so I want to welcome you to the show.
Thank you so much, Martin. It's a pleasure to be on.
Yes, and I think it's going to be an interesting topic. Before we get started and I start asking you questions about yourself and everything, I would like to tell you about a mistake I made and that someone profited very well, okay?
Great.
As an auction house. Now, I purchased the auction house from my father back in 1987. I think it was either 85 or 87. And he was actually with me the day I went into this person's house. There's a coastal town here in Massachusetts, Ipswich, Massachusetts. And it was a very nice house call. The guy had beautiful period antiques and paintings and really nice things, but he only wanted to sell a few things. First thing he said when we walked in the door, he said, I have a bunch of stuff in the garage. I had a garage sale. There's a bunch of junk left. I'm only going to do business with you if you take that stuff and sell it too. It's all in boxes. So we took a look around. And I talked to my father real quickly, and he says, yeah, we should do it. So I said, sure, we'll do it. So in that lot, he had me reach down into a clock, and he told me to open a bag, and I did, and there was a spoon, a silver spoon made by Paul Revere. There was, I think we got a really nice clock out of it. So it was well worth taking all the junk in the garage. Well, in a box in the garage, for those people watching on YouTube, I'm going to show you the image. I'm pretty sure this is it. And so in the box was a rug fragment, and it looked like it should have been thrown away in one of the boxes. And so basically, we're selling like box lots at the end of the auction, and the box went for $80 with that junky little rug in it, which was actually quite a bit of money back in 1987 for a box lot. So about a year later, somewhere around a year, maybe a year and a half later, I got a phone call, and it was from someone writing an article, a freelance writer writing an article for Time magazine. And she said, I would like to talk to you about a rug fragment that started out at your auction. So I said, really? I said, well, tell me the story about it if you would. And she said, well, it went through many hands. And she said, first, you sold it for $80. And I still didn't remember it at the time. I had to think about it. And then she told me who bought it, who came to the auction. And she said, well, he sold it for, say, $500. And she went down the path of where this went. It finally went to an auction in Brussels, and it sold for $350,000. So in 1987, that was a heck of a lot of money. And so I said, I will talk, I'll give you some information, but you can't say my name, the auction house, or even what state the auction house was in. So I was just too embarrassed. So this sort of thing happens, right? I mean, that's what you did your book on.
Exactly. Well, wonderful story. I'm sorry you were on the seller side and not on the buyer side.
yeah, that does happen a lot. And again, like I said, we're not here to squash the auction method, because it's a great method and there's a lot of great stories. I mean, I've made a lot of people really happy over the years of things that went the other way. But so a little bit about yourself. Can you tell us your background, what got you interested in art?
Sure. So I studied law, as you've understood by now, but I've always been passionate about art. I worked as a volunteer for several institutions, such as the Opera in Geneva, or currently the Élysée Photography Museum in Lausanne, to mobilize young people to get involved with culture and art. So this is always something that has fascinated me. And while studying law, I actually realized that law governs basically anything, including arts. So I was really thrilled to know that there was a way to combine both my passion and my law degree, and to actually specialize in art law.
Wow.
So I did that. I started a PhD in Geneva at the Art Law Center at the University in Geneva. And while doing that, I was teaching and researching art law, and it's a very broad field. So there is anything from the market, import, export, the protection of cultural heritage. You mentioned entertainment. So it's really, really broad, which is also why it's very fun.
Oh, it is very fun. I'm sure it is. And so as far as the topic of the book, was there something that personally happened to someone either you know or yourself for diving into a project like this?
So after the end of my law degree, I did an internship at Christie's legal department in London. I really wanted to know more about this auction world and how it works. And after this traineeship, I was so fascinated by it that I decided to write my PhD, and which is basically the book about the auction market. And I had no idea then what direction it would take, but I knew it would be about the auction world.
Oh, okay. So what about some of the stories? I think it would be, we have a lot of, I didn't realize this, we have quite a few people in chat already, and someone's already talking about Steiff teddy bears that brought thousands at an auction after they sold it. So there's some interest in chat too. So we'll probably have some questions from there. But I should ask you how you began a project like this.
So you begin with a theme, which was the auction business. And what interested me most at the beginning was the dispute resolution process, as a lawyer would be interested. So because you have this threefold relationship between the seller, the auction house, and the buyer, how do auction houses, manage once a dispute arises? So that was my first aim. And then I came across an article about the sale of a sleeper. And I was fascinated by that. And I thought this is a great topic because there is nothing about it. No one has written anything extensive about this phenomenon. And it combines everything. It combines art history, it combines the law, the market. I very quickly knew that this was what I wanted to write about. Sleepers at auction. So maybe I should define them because
yeah, okay.
It's quite a word that we hear now in the press. So sleepers are basically works of art or antiques that are being sold under a wrong attribution and under obviously a much underrated value. And the example I often give is, well, the one you gave is that you find something in your cellar and you think it's not worth much or anything, and it happens to be an old master painting. So, and there are quite a few stories like this,
yes.
Which is obviously the whole fascination.
Right. I just a quick example. I worked in California for 6 years at an auction house, and at that time there was a woman in Southern California that our truck went down to and picked up things out of her garage. Well, she had a painting in her garage that just sat there that she inherited from Italy. An old master dealer actually came to the house in Italy and he discounted it. And later it was attributed, and I can't remember the artist's name, but it went for $600,000, and I watched it just go up. So sometimes, what I'm getting at here is, sometimes it doesn't matter how it's attributed. If there's enough images online and people can see the details of it. Now this sold over the phone to Italy, and it actually sold. There was no problem with the sale, and it was 100% what the people were thinking it was. So sometimes it can be a mistake, and it has a really happy ending. This woman was thrilled. Of course, she was beside herself, paid off her house, put her kids through school, all that.
It does happen, but I would say you still take a risk because the attribution is not accurate. So, yes. And you hadn't had the time to do a full verification on the work. You didn't do any scientific testing and so on. So you still take a risk. And what I found out doing the analysis of all these cases was that in any event, you will never pay the actual market price for the work with its accurate attribution. You still kind of put yourself a limit as to what you want to buy for. It's gambling.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of gambling. There's a lot of gambling out there, and that's kind of an attraction to dealers. I really think that, I know I have a lot of dealer friends that they go to every single auction. And, in Europe where you are, there's a lot more auctions than there are here in the United States, especially in England. There's, 5 auctions every day of the week, at least in London. But there are people that are out there. It's kind of like fishing. They're trying to catch the big fish. And I know a lot of stories where I want to tell you an example before we get into some of the examples you have. And this actually happened to a friend of mine. He went to an auction where something was properly attributed, and nobody bid. He bought this painting for $60,000, I think it was, with his brother and himself, and they turned around and resold it for $800,000. What is the legality? Is there any legality issue in a case like that?
So in this case, there was no change as to the attribution. It was basically only a pricing issue.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, if you are the seller and there is no intermediary, there is no auction house, for example, well, then you set the price you want, basically. That's the rules of the market that apply. However, if there is an auction house that is an intermediary, the auction house has some duties of care, including the duty to assess the item properly. So that could be an issue if pricing has not been. I mean, the estimate price, for example, has not been established properly. But it's a really tricky undertaking.
Yes. Can you let's talk about some of the examples that you have in your book. And I don't know. I do have some images that I can pull up as we're talking about it, but I don't know exactly what you're going to be talking about.
Sure.
So let's start out with one of the more exciting or maybe legal issues that happened during a find, a sleeper.
So basically, sleepers happen if no one realizes, and especially the auction house doesn't realize what the actual value and attribution of the object is. So what mostly happens is there is a very low estimate price for the work, and it gets sold at a much higher price, hammer price, and very quickly afterwards, a few months later, there is a second sale with the accurate attribution, and there it gets sold for much more. So this is a scenario that I've come across in a few cases. I give you an example. There was a regional auction house in England, in Somerset, that had offered a jug, and it attributed it as a 19th century French claret jug. That was in early 2008. And the estimate price range for that item was between 100 and 200 pounds. Now, the lot was finally sold to a buyer for 220,000 pounds. So you can tell there was quite an increase here. Wow. And so everyone understood that something must have gone wrong in this sale. And here, the auction house managed to agree with the buyer to cancel the sale and to re-offer the jug at Christie's. And Christie's then offered the same item under its actual and correct attribution, which said that it was actually dated 10th or early 11th century and crystal ore made for the court of the Fatimid rulers of Cairo. So a very prestigious object, not just a jug. And the sale estimate price was £3 million, and it actually sold for that amount. So here we really have a very impressive price increase.
Amazing. Now, how on earth did the auction house work out a deal with? I don't understand. With the buyer is actually going to give up his jackpot and actually let go of the possibility of that type of money? How did that work out?
No, probably what happened here was that all parties agreed to re-offer the sale at auction and that they would all get a percentage of the sale price. But all of this is obviously confidential. So we only get to know about it if the media tells it or if there is a court case. And here, there was no court, there was no case law that we could rely upon. So all we know is what the press has told us. So I assume that there must have been some financial arrangement.
Yeah, I would only think that that is very rare. I mean, I had a situation once where I had a reserve on an item and, a minimum bid, and it was the man said he wanted 6 for it, and I thought he meant 600, but he wanted 6,000, and and it sold for less than that, and the buyer was grateful enough to have me cancel the sale on that. But usually, when a buyer gets a score, they're not going to let go, and they don't have to let go, really, right?
At auction, no. I mean, they buy the item as it is attributed. However, the sale conditions of auction houses are generally quite broadly formulated in the sense that auction houses have room to cancel auction sales under certain conditions. So they have some sort of flexibility.
I see. Okay. So you actually looked at my website and saw the show that I did with Martin Kemp about the Salvador Mundi. That was the last show that I did. Did you look into the legal aspects of that, of what that whole situation? And because I don't really have the background details of how that all came about in the beginning.
It came out, I wasn't made aware of it before the book was published, so it wasn't part of my analysis, but I'm actually quite flattered that the most expensive work ever sold at auction is a sleeper.
That's right. So, so that originated, as far as I know, the image is up there now, that originated in a New Orleans auction house and sold for... This is for the person that didn't listen to my last show. I think it sold for something like $18,000, something like that. And what was the final bid? Let's see. It went through several hands, and actually a Russian oligarch owned it at the last part of it. Almost sounded like he was money laundering because it had a low estimate on it, lower estimate than what he paid for it. So that's why I say the money laundering. I hope I don't get found out for saying that. But anyway, it backfired if that's what he was doing. It went for 425 million, something like that.
Without the hammer price, yeah.
Yeah.
Without the buyer's commission, sorry.
Yeah. So that tops them all that I know of, as far as prices at auction. So what would be the legal aspect of that as far as when it comes to the auction house that originally sold that? I mean, what would happen?
Well, what you want to probably find out now is what the remedies are to the consignor. What can the consignor do, who is obviously very frustrated that he has sold a work that has now been sold further for a much higher amount. So generally, what the legal standard is here is to establish that the auction house had been negligent in the attribution process, because basically the auction house owes the consignor a duty of diligence and a duty of care. And that encompasses not only the attribution that each auction houses compiles in the catalog, but also the estimate price, which obviously were both wrong in the event of a sleeper. And it's really a difficult proof, because the consignor has to look at the circumstances surrounding the given sale and establish that the auction house had been negligent not to consult certain sources, certain catalogs, certain experts, or conducting scientific testing, for example. So it requires understanding the attribution process at auction, and it requires also to understand the legal, the reasoning, that should have brought the auction house to the right attribution. And it's a fascinating process. So I was actually once at the court hearing of a sleeper case at the London Court of Justice. And they had to buy extra screens so as to show the extent of documentation that was and evidence that was made available by experts and scientific analysis. And it was a very, very large enterprise for days, basically, to explain to the court, the process of attribution and to analyze every little inch of a painting and what, makes it be something, of the hand of the given artist or not. So it's really impressive.
Do you remember in particular what that piece was?
Yes, that was the Lancelot Twice versus Sotheby's case regarding an alleged Caravaggio painting, which has never been attributed to Caravaggio since, I should say.
I think I have. I thought I had the image of that. I don't think so. So that. How did that ever? What was the final outcome of that?
Well, the consignor lost. Basically, the court judge ruled in favor of the auction house, concluding that it had not been negligent in coming to the conclusion that the work was not by Caravaggio but by a follower of Caravaggio, and therefore did not owe any damages to the consignor.
Oh, I see. And so what about in a case like that? I'm just pulling up the image now. In a case like that, what happens to all the expenses that the auction house concurs in a situation like that?
Well, that was actually quite sad in this case, as it was the consignor who had to pay for the huge amount of litigation costs and fees that had occurred, which I think, I don't remember exactly, but they were about £2 million. So these are huge amounts, and that have to be borne by the party who basically loses the case.
Wow. That's really something to think of when someone is going to try to move forward in a situation like that. Now I'm going to ask you a question as a previous auction house owner myself. When a work comes in, where does the line approximately cross where there's due diligence on a piece? And when I say due diligence, I mean to the part where you're talking about scientific study, where you get into real deep study and you hire an expert. If something is, in my opinion, if something's worth, 10,000 or less, you kind of just let it fly. You say it's signed this, it's that, it's, by the artist. But there's a line where if it gets crossed, then that's when you should be bringing in like the expert. Do you kind of understand where I'm going with this?
Yes, which is also why the legal standard is so difficult to apprehend, because it basically does not look at the result. So is there a misattribution? Yes, then the auction house is faulty. No, it looks at the process. So courts have actually held that clients, consignors, and buyers cannot expect that an auctioneer has closely examined all property and guarantees the accuracy of the catalog descriptions. So it doesn't infer any liability based on the wrong attribution, but one has to look at the process. And here is this line that is really difficult to draw, whereas the auction house must consult with, the closest available information. But of course, no one can expect an auction house to be an art historian and to conduct provenance research for months. That would be really contrary to the auction business. So it's a very hypothetical and fluid threshold that is being applied, and which is difficult to understand how it's implemented in practice.
Have you seen cases that it was, are these actually like juried trials where there's a jury involved, or is it just a judge present?
It's just a judge.
And have you ever seen a case where it just dragged on and they just couldn't understand how to judge in this certain circumstance? Or are they always looking for some type of precedence? And do they create a precedence with a judgment?
Yes. So there are cases that have been judged in the 90s, and the case law has set a precedent as to some of the requirements and standards of negligence. But there are not many court cases actually on sleepers. So there is still room for judges to set their own standards. But I would say most of the cases are really difficult to understand and involve expert testimony. So you would have experts that would just be called on the stand and explain their view of the market, of the attribution, and of the painting.
Yeah, I've done some of that expert testimony, and it is grueling. I never look forward to it. It's not fun at all. Can you also tell, let's hear another one of the stories that you have in your book, if you would.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So there was a case that I looked into because it was also quite impressive in terms of figures, which concerns a carpet that was sold at a local auction house in Germany. And it was considerably undersold because the local auction house failed to identify that it was originating from the mid-17th century in Kerman in southeast Persia. So it was offered at auction for 900 euros and subsequently sold at Christie's under its enhanced provenance, which was that the carpet had once been owned by the Countess of Beag, who had amassed an impressive collection of Iranian art. And the change in attribution actually dramatically impacted the estimate price, which Christie's set at £200,000 to £300,000. And at the auction, two interested buyers were bidding against each other until the lot reached a final hammer price of £6.2 million, including commissions.
Goodness. I have the image of that up now. It is a beautiful, beautiful piece. And the thing that people never realize about rugs or anything that is made out of fabric is it's biodegradable. For something to be around and look in that condition, there's probably repairs in it, but for something to be around that long is quite amazing, actually. In the case of that you've looked into this, were there ever any instances where there was greed involved and mishandled pieces just out of greed, someone trying to make the big score? Anything like that come to mind?
I would say it's in sleeper cases. I wouldn't see any, greed, but the only thing that comes to mind is that obviously because of time, and catalog deadlines, auction houses don't only have that amount of time to establish correct attribution. So if you speak of greed, that's the only thing that comes to mind. And obviously conducting scientific testing on each lot would mean that, the consignments would be very expensive. So, in that regard, obviously, one can always do more and spend more money on establishing the authenticity of a work of art.
Another thing, who bears the cost of, say, there potentially a really nice piece comes into an auction house. Now they have to get it, authenticated by the expert. It's not free. A lot of times there's shipping involved. And who bears the cost of that generally? Is it a auction house or the consignor?
It depends on the case. The general conditions of sale would say that any expert advice is on the client to be paid. But there is always room for negotiation, and the auction house can find a different deal. But that is what is usual, and that's also what auction houses recommend to their clients, is that they come in with their experts and consult with their experts beforehand, if they want to make sure that the attribution is correct.
Now, do you have any cases that you can think of when the actual expert was wrong? They made a mistake, because they do make mistakes.
The famous forgery cases that we all know have involved experts who were wrong There is the Wolfgang Beltracchi forgery case that was extensively written about and told about, which involved experts who authenticated his works, and that's what also reassured then the auction houses to sell them on.
So what was the final outcome of that in particular in a case like that?
Well, I know of one court case that was that involved a painting by that was attributed to Campendonk, but was originally by the forger. And here the buyers actually sued the auction house in Germany, and they won the case. So the auction house had to pay them the damages that they incurred from purchasing the forgery. Now, the forgery cases are much easier from a legal perspective because the law protects the buyer of a forgery, and you have a certain amount of years during which you can go back to the auction house and reclaim the money you've paid if you actually purchased something that is not authentic.
Yeah, there seems to be there can be a lot of gray areas in this, which I think is kind of interesting. Now, what about the Bella Principessa? Now, that's something I did a show on a while back. Did you have that in your book by chance?
Of course.
Oh,
that was actually a case from the United States that also led to a trial. And the Bella Principessa is basically a work that scholars attributed to Leonardo da Vinci after it was sold at auction for $21,000. So we now know what a Da Vinci painting is worth under its correct attribution. So there was obviously quite a gap. And in that case, what was interesting was that the consignor had actually informed the auction house that he believed the painting was by an early Italian Renaissance painter who had apprenticed at the time at the same time as Leonardo da Vinci. So, the whole case was also about, what use was that information for the auction house to find maybe a link to da Vinci.
Now, pardon me, I'm sorry. Didn't they have that cataloged as a German painting originally? I'm just trying to recall.
Yes, exactly. It was actually catalogued as according to the complaint, it was the auction house concluded that it was an amateur object of the 19th century. And the complaint also said that the auction house had spent 15 minutes examining the painting. But finally, we will never know what the court would have ruled on the merits of this case because the claim was basically time-barred, so it was filed too late.
Oh, so you mean it just couldn't go anywhere because of...
Exactly. You have to act within a certain time period.
All right. So where do you know? I heard when I spoke with Martin Kemp last that was just sitting in a vault somewhere, and for sale. But have you heard about anything about that lately? Anything that's going on with it?
Not lately, but I'm not surprised about the outcome. And this is something that I have seen before regarding works that have come to the courts and for which the attribution or the authenticity was at dispute. Because very often, all court cases are public, so everyone will know about it. And the public will also know that the authenticity is questioned. And if there is no anonymous opinion of all scholars that are regarded as the authority for that artist on, whether or not the painting is authentic, well, then it remains in some sort of a limbo status and can't be sold because people will always have doubts. So yes, this is something that has happened before.
Right, right. So the internet comes along in the late 90s, or I should say the early 90s, and changes everything. And you probably weren't practicing law back then. um, but uh, but in your opinion, are there old cases, or do you think it happens more now that the auction houses have, an internet platform, or what difference do you think that could make over just plain catalogs?
Well, I know from dealers who have specialized in finding sleepers. They have now shifted their business from looking at printed catalogs to looking at online catalogs. So they have told me that basically they trained their eye to become a digital eye, and it makes their work much easier because they have access to much more information and much more sales than before. So that has certainly changed the way the market is now happening. I'm not sure in the amount of sleepers. I mean, there's certainly also an increase in sales. Proportionally, there might be also more sleepers. But interestingly, sleepers generally happen when a big estate gets sold, or when you do an entire house sale, including all furniture and its entire art collection. So when you have big amounts of works that need to be authenticated for a specific sale, that's usually when a sleeper slips through.
Right, right. We have up on the chat room saying there's so many forgeries out there, and coins and paintings and stamps. And I've said this many times: a painting is guilty till it's proven innocent, and it's just authenticating. There are so many forgeries out there, and I would suggest to the person listening, if they're going to buy a painting, to make sure they know what they're buying, because any signature can be on a painting, first of all. And my father told me when I was really young, and because I picked up a painting that was a forgery, and I thought it was real, and he came out and he said, "It's a piece of junk." He looked at it. It was in my garage. "It's a piece of junk." And I said, "Yeah, but it's signed Abbott Fuller Graves." And he said, "Always look at the painting first." He said, "Pretend a painting doesn't have a signature. Look at the painting, then look at the signature." Mm. And I think that there's a lot of truth in that. I mean, I've been doing that ever since.
I second that. It's good to get advice before and do your research, and don't act under stress when you purchase a work of art.
So I know a number of people that in the old days, this is what they used to do. We were talking about internet just a minute ago. I know this guy that survived and did very, very well. Beautiful house, nice cars, everything on sleepers. That's all he ever did. He was an art dealer. He would get a weekly periodical that showed auctions coming up. He'd look for auctions with paintings. It didn't matter where in the country they were. And I watched him because I shared an office with him for a while. And so he would circle all these auction houses, and they'd call every single one of them. He'd spend an entire day. And he said, "Hi, my name is such and such. Hey, by the way, I see you have some paintings. Do you happen to have any paintings that you don't have pictured or listed?" He used to say that every time. And a good part of the time, they'd say yes. And he says, "Oh, can you send me pictures, please? And if they're signed, send me pictures of the signature." And he made his living off of that alone, just by calling these auction houses. So what is your advice for someone that actually is looking for sleepers?
Well, the advice I got from Sleeper Sleuth was to train your eye, because that's the first thing that will help you to identify, as your colleague did. and then to have a real proper look at it. So to go actually to the auction room if you still have time and look at it and turn the painting around. That was also something that he advised me, but that's obviously completely out of the legal sphere. So I leave that to the art historians and experts.
I know of a number of cases that have happened over the years, and one of them I want to just tell a real quick story because you probably heard of this particular case. Has nothing to do with auctions, but it's still a fascinating story. In the Midwest, in the United States, in the Midwest, there was a scrap silver gold dealer, and you probably already know the story before I even get going too far in it. So he gets this egg. This person brings him this egg, and they had it in their family. They had no idea what it was, and he thought it was absolutely beautiful, and it had a watch mounted inside. He had no idea what it was, but he knew the watch was good, so he paid them basically $14,000 for this egg. So he starts to look at it, and he starts to, check things, and he weighs the gold, and he realizes he's going to lose money on his $14,000. He gets really frustrated. He goes online. Eventually, it turns into a $33 million Fabergé lost egg. I mean, this is a really good example when someone needs to hire a professional, I think.
Yes, it's a great catch, definitely. But it's what I loved when talking about sleepers also to students, or when I discussed it within the university. It gets you the feeling that basically anyone could just find something in his own cellar that is actually much more valuable than what he thought it would be. So it's like winning at the lottery, basically.
That's right. That's right. And I do have a lot of stories of things that have happened. And I don't know if you want me to, we still have time here if you want me to share a couple of them that are
Please.
Interesting. And I want to hear some of you, if you have some more stories as well. I have a friend, and he actually went into an antique shop. Now, there was an auction. To back it up, there was an auction. There was a library. And in the library, there was a bunch of leather-bound books, nothing really fancy. I think the antique dealer paid, say, $400 for the entire library. He put them in boxes, and he basically, and it was a really extensive library, so there was a lot of boxes. So he put them in his shop for like $15 a box. And so this guy, a friend, actually went into the shop, and he reached down, he's looking at all the different books, and then he sees something interesting, picks it up. And I believe it was a handwritten transcript from Edgar Allan Poe, an entire book transcript. Bottom line is he got, I'm pretty sure it was just about $2 million for that single book that he paid $15 for. So I said, what was it like? What did you think when you saw that? And he said he was trying to stop his hands from shaking because he knew what he had when he paid the $15. So I also talked to the owner, the guy that sold it for $15, and he just laughed. He said, "Knowledge is power," and that's kind of what this is all about. Knowledge is power.
But isn't it crazy that the object hasn't changed? You say his hands was shaking, were shaking, but it's still the same object, basically. But it's crazy how our appreciation of an item changes as soon as, the label is different.
That's right. And it's all about provenance and story. You mentioned earlier this carpet because it belonged to, what was it, a princess or?
It's a countess of Beag. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, in your opinion, let's talk about provenance. How much of a difference does that make? Has any attribution ever happened and they found out later, besides this, that the provenance made the difference?
Well, I'd say that provenance is often one of the factors that makes a difference, because obviously it will be linked to dating the item, and figuring out its location of origin if it's an antique. So it's often very much linked to all the other elements of an item's attribution. But certainly if you would have twice the same painting and one has been part of the royal collections, that one will be more valuable than the other one. So provenance has that additional factor also in terms of value.
Right. I have a friend who basically says if it loses its story, it loses its value. There's something to that. Not totally, because a lot of things are just just stand on their own. And you see this happen sometimes when pieces are unsigned, they're not particularly old. But in a case like that, say a contemporary artwork, unsigned, it comes in. Now, there was another case I heard about also in California where there was a whole bunch of artwork sold by one artist, and it ends up the person made millions and millions of dollars. They were all unsigned. I mean, a consigner consigning something that's unsigned, what type of responsibility, first of all, would an auction house have in an unsigned piece as far as liability?
Well, you would generally, first of all, look at civil liability, and this would be, again, a forgery case. So these are much more straightforward, since the law here would protect the buyer, obviously. But again, you have to act within a certain time period, which sometimes can be really tricky. And I know that in Switzerland, for example, the law has changed for art and cultural property specifically, and we have extended that time limit to 30 years because we've realized that it might be actually really difficult to find out whether something is a fake or not. So the buyer in that case could just simply turn to the auction house and ask to cancel the sale and be refunded. On the consigner, well, if he knew that that he was basically offering forgeries for sale, then he might be liable for fraud. So that's another level of action.
Right. Just one more quick story I'll tell, and then I'm going to ask you to tell stories. And this has to do with something that I have to say that I got involved in back in the early days of eBay. They didn't used to have spell checks. So I was going through one day. I mean, they had searches, and I was on a search list of all different types of artists. And I had an art gallery at the time. And I was selling basically 19th and 20th century art. So I did this search. I would search purposely and misspell an artist's name. And one day I had a bingo, and it was a really, really good artist. The artwork itself, now I can't recall the artist right now, but it was worth about 20 or 25,000, something like that. And I bought it for under $1,000. I was so excited. And all of a sudden, the person selling it said, nope, it's not for sale. All of a sudden just stopped. So someone either alerted them. I think that's what happened. And I couldn't get anywhere. So do people, as far as you know, do people actually troll around the internet and look for misspellings? That simple.
I haven't come across a misspelling in the very high range art sector, I would say. And the people I spoke with were mostly, looking at local auction houses, but more art specific. And I think that the misspellings, they occur mostly when no art professional is involved. So, typically eBay, as you mentioned, because it's directly between two individuals. And huge quantities also of art being offered, at a very fast pace. So it's that the origins of the mistake could be quite similar.
Right. Do you have another story you can share with us?
Sure. So I've mentioned the fact that sleepers happened often when you have big estates that are being sold. And that was one case that was shared with me by an auction house that I consulted whilst writing the book. And it concerned a British businessman and art collector who died in 1995. And his heirs decided to sell his collection. and consigned a painting for sale at Sotheby's. And basically, the painting was bought by the art collector at a country house auction in the 40s, and he stored it in a chicken shed ever since. He believed the painting to be by an Italian artist called Pietro Testa, but he had never valued it during his lifetime. So when it was presented to Sotheby's, the painting was actually covered by a thick layer of dust and dirt, but otherwise was in good condition. And the auction house offered the painting for sale under the Pietro Testa attribution and put an estimate price range of £10,000 to £15,000. And two galleries were actually bidding against each other for the painting. And it finally went for £155,000, so 10 times the actual estimate.
Wow.
And after the sale, the painting was cleaned and restored, and it was actually it was authenticated by the then leading experts for Poussin, which were Pierre Rosenberg and Dennis Mahon, and they both authenticated it as an original Nicolas Poussin painting, which was finally sold under its accurate attribution and title for £4.5 million. So again, a very impressive value increase here.
Amazing, amazing. Someone just asked, is ignorance a crime? And in a way, and I just wrote them back, yes, it's supposed to be when you're supposed to be a professional, yes. In a way, it could become one, right? I mean, that's the easiest way to answer that.
Well, there are different layers of ignorance, I would say. There's the ignorance that you shouldn't be if something is really obvious, and then there is negligence that that you can't be liable for. So this is what makes it so difficult, because we all look at the result. We all look at, what is the actual artist of the painting. We don't really want to know whether one should have been careful enough and be able to establish that new attribution. This is what makes it so tricky to fight these cases.
I bet. So we only have a couple minutes left here. Do you have another story you can pop in there? I mean, if you don't, I have one I could tell too.
Great, go along, please.
Oh, you sure? Okay. Now, this. Well, first of all, I wanted to ask you this question, and it's okay if we go a little bit over, and that is, don't you agree that it doesn't matter what auction house it is? It doesn't matter who the experts are. I mean, I've heard one of the big New York auction houses made I think it was a several $1 million mistake on a Asian art piece. This was about 5 or 6 years ago. It doesn't matter what auction house it is, right? I mean, do you agree with that?
I agree. I mean, sleeper cases have arisen at any kind of auction house, whether it's a very local small auction house or one of the big international auction houses. From a legal perspective, there is a difference. So both kinds of auction houses will not be held to the same standard. So judges are actually sensitive as to, what means does an auction house have in order to assess an attribution. Right.
Okay, so I'm going to I really don't want to end the show on a negative note like this, but this is kind of a sad story, because it happened to a friend of mine. He grew up in a wealthy family, and he had an artwork. Oh, I have another story I can tell you about after that'll real quickly that'll end on a good note. So my friend, he has an artist. I think it was someone like George Braque or someone like that. It was a major artwork, but this artist was known for having two different eras of work, two different values of work. through one of his eras and one of his times in life, his paintings didn't sell so well. Now, this goes back before the internet. This was several years ago. So he brings the painting down to one of the two big auction house. Well, there's three big auction houses in New York City, and he brings it in, and they consult, and they said, basically this is the low estimate. The lower, like the $30,000 range. Your painting's in like the 30 to 40. That's what we had estimated at. And so my friend says, okay, go ahead, sell it. And so almost a year goes by, they still don't sell the painting, and he's wondering what's going on. So he's in New York, and he says, and he's aware of the two different types of prices these pieces bring. So he says to them, basically, what's going on with the painting? No one's answering a call. And they said, well, we actually have someone that is offering to purchase this painting at the low estimate. So he says, really? The $30,000. And he just got this feeling, and it didn't feel right. And he says, bring me my painting now. So he had to wait for 2 or 3 hours before they got it out of storage and actually brought it to him. And he was furious. And he basically went to the other big auction house in New York City, and it sold for $350,000. Now that is a case of greed right there. I mean, that there was something underhanded going on, and that's one of the major auction houses. So I don't want anyone to think that this happens a lot, but occasionally something like this has happened. It does happen.
I mean, at the end, the good news about all these cases is that we discover a masterpiece that we've thought to be lost forever. So that's the bright side to any case.
Yes, and we're going to talk about your book as we close, so people know where to find that. But I would like to, unless you want to end with a story, I'll end with one more story.
Okay. I mean, we've all remember the yard sale of the Ding bowl. So we've mentioned that it's always when big collections are getting sold that mistakes happen. You've mentioned also online auction platforms, and another source for sleepers is yard sales. So there was this case of a family in New York who purchased a finely potted bowl at a yard sale for $3. And they brought the bowl to Sotheby's for an appraisal. And Sotheby's actually found out that it was a bowl from the Ding Northern Song dynasty with an estimate of $200,000 to $300,000. And it was catalogued as being one of the two last well-known pieces, the other one being held by the British Museum in London. And it was finally sold to a Londoner art dealer for, hold yourself, 2 million, I should say, way above $2 million,
Goodness.
Including buyer's premium. So, I mean, the family must have been really thrilled.
Wow. So $3 turned into $2 million. That's
$2 million,
that's
exactly.
Definitely winning the lottery. And also, just so someone knows, I've been at this for 45 years plus. I hate to say it, but around that, and it doesn't happen that much, but it does happen. It doesn't happen. I mean,
exactly.
I go to a lot of estate sales, and all right. So I'll just tell this quick story because it also happened to a friend of mine when I was living out in California. He would get Craigslist, look through Craigslist and online, and this person in the actual town where he was from said they had a table for sale. And so they had a picture of it, and he thought it looked pretty nice, kind of the type of thing he sells. He sold a lot of French furniture and decorative arts. So he drives to their house and takes a look at it, and he looks at it was mounted with a Sèvres porcelain cameo plate in the center of this table. Takes a look at it, and the plate's cracked right in the middle. So he says, what are you looking for? And they said, they wanted $1,000, and he said, well, it's cracked. He says, I do like it. I'll give you 800. So he did a show, and he had it in his show for a few $1,000s, an antique show. And the whole day went by, and finally someone came by, and they said, I think I'll take that. And he says, he goes, it's sold. It's sold. He changed his mind. And because he just started getting this feeling about it. So he brought it into Bonham's out in San Francisco, Butterfields at the time. They took a look at it, and the guy got so excited about it. He said, this is really, really good. He said, we would like to take it. He talked to his colleagues. He said, we'd like to put a $300,000 estimate on it. So now this is something psychologically I've seen happen a lot. All of a sudden, that number gets thrown at you. You get scared and nervous. This is what happened to him. So he said, I don't want to commit to that. So he sent a picture to, pretty sure it was Sotheby's in New York City. They flew someone out to look at the table in the next couple of days. And so it ended up being the cover lot of the catalog, ended up being one of two tables known by this certain French maker. They repaired the ceramic piece that was broken, and he said that he was on the phone when it brought $2.5 million. So yeah, it's about the same. He did it all right. It's about the same as a $3 pot, yeah. Which is a really fun business, and there are treasures. And there's a lot of times where someone will take a chance on something and they'll lose their shirt. So there are two sides to it.
That's true.
Can you give the listening audience your information, how they could contact you if you'd like to hear from them, or where to find your book, and the name and the title of your book, if you would?
Sure, I'm more than happy to. So my book is called The Sale of Misattributed Artworks and Antiques at Auction. It's published by Edward Elgar Publishing. You can find it on Edward Elgar's webpage. And it's also on my webpage. And if you would like to contact me, I have my contact details. My webpage is artsandlaw.ch.
Art and Law. Okay. Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Martin. Really, I had great fun.
Yes, I really enjoyed talking to you today. And, just one last question. Do you have any thoughts of writing any other books, similar? Or I'm sure a lot of times what happens is someone all of a sudden hears about a whole bunch of new things coming down the line. Have you had any plans on writing again?
Sure, of course. I'm writing about artists and their rights to authenticate works of art. So I look at copyright now, and whether artists are entitled to determine whether works of art that they have actually created, or forgeries, so that they have not created, whether they have a right to say that it has, their paternity or not. So I look at artists' rights, the power of artists, basically, and unfinished works of art and disavowed works of art. So all about that. Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Well, thanks so much. Again, it's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Martin.
Okay. Bye now.
Bye.
All right, everyone. So thanks so much for checking us out today. And we'll be back at another time with another show on antiques. Thanks again, and talk to you next time.